This is Grandmaster Eugene Perelshteyn, and today we're gonna cover the Sicilian wing gambit. How do you refute this gambit, you may wonder? So let me share with you what I discovered. After the moves e4, c5, a lot of club players may try this tricky move b4. Now, the point of this gambit is after c takes b4, and this is my recommendation, white gets this pawn away from the center. So the point now is the d pawn together with the e pawn can fight for the center. Of course, white gave up an entire pawn. So typically they play a3 to try to trade the a pawn and get the b pawn also as far away as possible from the center. And here, black has a lot of options. I'm going to recommend to you a little bit rare move, but my favorite move, e5. Remember, when faced with a gambit and you already won one pawn, don't forget the center and development. With this pawn move, look what we're doing. We're fighting for the center, and the bishop now protects the b4 pawn. So what could happen in this position? Well, the main move probably you will see is knight f3. White usually is not interested in taking on b4. But let's take a look at that first. After pawn takes b4, of course, we're going to take with the bishop. And after c3, we typically retreat to e7. Again, white can start with knight f3 or d4. d4 is most likely the move. And now this position may be a little bit echoing to you the line against the Evans gambit that I recommended, where we actually grab the b4 pawn, retreat the bishop to e7, and then try to punish white in the center. So here again, don't be greedy, don't try to take on d4, don't go for trades, don't give white any kind of tempi. Instead, develop, develop, develop. Knight f6, exclam. This is my favorite move here. And you may wonder, okay, what if white simply takes on e5? Well, in that case, we can take the center pawn, knight takes e4. And we'll take a look at this position shortly. But first, you may wonder, okay, what if white simply develops? Let's say bishop d3. In that case, we again strike the center, d5. Very thematic. And after he takes on e5, same idea. We simply take on e4. And let's say both sides continue with their development. Castles, castles, knight c6, bishop f4. Guess what? We are still up a pawn. Honestly, I don't see any compensation for white. So let's go back. And again, take a look if he tries d takes e5. And now the only way to justify this sort of pseudo-active play for white, he can try this move queen g4. What is the point? He's hitting the g7 pawn and he's hitting the knight. Well, we got to do something about that. Knight g5 is the best move. And there are two ways he can attack the knight. He can play h4. He can play f4. Now, taking on g5 makes no sense because we're going to take back with the bishop and simply drop back to h6. Bishop is actually quite safe there. For instance, queen e4, castles. He thinks he's about to checkmate us with this battery, but actually, after a simple move g6, black is completely fine. Surprisingly, that bishop is actually protecting the dark squares around their king. And if he castles, d5 is very thematic, hitting the queen, blowing open the center. We have the bishop pair. Remember, we're still up a pawn. Black is much, much better here. So going back to move 9, white can try either f4 or h4. Let's look at both of these options. Now, if white plays h4, we're going to go to e6. And after bishop c4, again, very thematic, d5. And we're not worried about en passant because we can take with the queen. We can castle next, develop. Again, very easy position to play. And finally, if white plays the most logical move f4, trying to ram through with the f pawn, this is the key move, guys. d5. Again, we're using the fact the x-ray on the queen. We're gaining the e4 outpost for our knight. Okay, and after queen retreats, knight e6. In this case, you don't want to go to e4, although you could, but that would require you to give up the g7 pawn, which I'm not quite ready to give up because our rook is under attack. Instead, knight e6, setting up a very nasty trap. Can you see what happens if he plays f5? Take a look at the king, take a look at the queen, and there is a big oopsies. Queen is lost. So f5 is not possible. White has to play knight f3 with the big threat of f5. Luckily, it's our turn, and after g6, all of white's threats are stopped. Black is simply a pawn up. So, as I said, most players on move 4 will not take on b4. They'll just develop the knight. All right, we're going to do the same, knight c6. The game is very similar to e4, e5 opening, as you see, rather than the Sicilian defense. And now white has probably the most obvious move, bishop c4, develop naturally. We're going to take a look at this next. But first, I want to show you a really cool idea if white puts the bishop on b2. It looks as though we have to protect the pawn. Well, there's a very sneaky move and very rare move, I have to say, that only happened in about 9 games in the entire database, setting up an amazingly cool trap. And this move is queen b6. You may wonder, what is this queen b6 all about? Aren't you giving up your e-pawn? Okay, white could take the pawn right away, or white can play bishop c4 and sort of continue with development. So let's take a look at knight takes pawn first. What is this trap you're talking about, you may wonder? Now, very important moment. Don't take the knight. And a lot of you may want to take the knight right away. No, first, we take on a3. Notice the big problem. Bishop is under attack, and the bishop has to guard the knight. The only reasonable move is bishop c3, and now a remarkable move for us. a2. Yes, we are giving up that proud soldier, that pawn that journeyed all the way to a2 from c7. And now, after white takes the pawn, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, we have the point of the queen on b6, double attack. Queen e6, hitting the bishop, and the rook on a2. And now everything sort of becomes clear. It's not easy for white to get his pieces organized. So rook a5 is the only move to not lose material, and the next sequence is entirely forced. b6, okay, well, rook has no good squares. Rook b5 or rook d5, right? Well, rook b5 is only going to get hit by the pawn. And if rook d5, we're going to play f6. Bishop has to retreat. Doesn't really matter where the bishop goes. Let's just say bishop b2. We take the pawn. Keep in mind, we are also hitting the rook, forcing white to block with the queen. And after the trade, we insert another beautiful tactic, the simple skewer, hitting the rook and the g2 pawn. And now that the dust has cleared, let's pause and take toll of this position. It's an endgame with 2 extra pawns for black. I don't see much compensation for white, honestly. Black should be able to convert. So this is a pretty long sequence, and it all began with this tricky move, queen b6. And if knight takes e5, again, the key move here is to take here first, insert the move a2, and then you go into this position. Okay, very important sequence. Now, of course, white does not have to grab that center pawn, but it is very tempting, I have to say. And instead, white can try simple move bishop d3. It's an odd looking move, I have to say. You're blocking the d pawn. It has been tried in the correspondence game, I don't think it's a serious move. Let me just show you simple setup for black. You put the pawn on d6, you develop the knight. If pawn takes, you always take with the knight. Now bishop on d3 is under attack. White wasted another tempo, and black simply finishes development, as happened in this correspondence game, which I believe black is simply better. All right, so this is what happens if after the move knight c6, white develops naturally bishop b2. Again, the key move is, remember, queen b6. And finally, our main line, simple chess, bishop c4 with idea to castle. All right, well, this resembles, for those of you who are familiar with the two knights defense, this is exactly the two knights defense in a weird situation where we have an extra pawn as black and the pawn is on b4. I believe this favors black. So queen e2 is the simple move, just trying to protect the e-pawn and then develop. But let's take a look at the knight g5, similar to the fried liver hitting the f7 pawn. In this case, we play d5, and after pawn takes, very important move, guys. This is the key move to get a big advantage for black. We don't take back the pawn. Instead, b5 exclam. This is vital to play b5 here to gain an advantage. And if white takes the pawn, he's going to give up the center pawn. Queen takes d5, hitting the g2, as well as the bishop, of course. And if white plays simple move like bishop a4, queen takes g2 and offers the queen trade, again, we are much better here as black. And if white tries a little bit sneaky move c4, hitting our queen here, again, we have several options. We can take on g2, but I simply like en passant knight takes. And now again, we go into the similar type of endgame. Rook is under attack. We trade queens, bishop d7. Black is much better. All right, so this is quite important. And finally, if white says, you know what, I'm not interested in trading my d pawn for your b pawn, I'm just going to retreat to a2. This has been played in a tournament game, and I believe black can get a very simple advantage with this centralizing move, knight d4. And funny enough, having the pawn on b4 actually helps us, and now we play b3, forcing the better trade. So bishop takes, knight takes, queen takes, queen d5. And now, again, once the dust has cleared, black is on top. White managed to get his pawn back, okay? But just compare the value of each piece. Two bishops, much better center structure. This bishop is locked in. The knight is locked in. It's much more pleasant to play black. So that brings us into our main line, queen e2. Simple developing move. We're also going to develop easily. And after pawn takes, all right, now we're going to have to waste the tempo. But hey, we still have an extra pawn. c3, bishop e7. Again, this is the echo of the Evans gambit, where we grab the pawn and go back to e7. Castles, castles, d4, simply d6. I don't think white has much compensation here. So this has happened before, also in one correspondence game. And let me just show you the simple setup for black. White played rook d1. Notice the little x-ray on our queen. So queen c7 is an excellent spot. Queen protects everything here, including the e5 pawn indirectly. h3, h6, knight bd2. And now the typical setup here is you put the rook on e8, bishop on f8, just like in many Roy Lopez type of positions, with pressure along the e file, because the queen is misplaced here on e2. For example, rook e8, knight f1, bishop f8, knight g3, and here I want to take advantage of the e file pressure by taking the pawn. Well, the most logical way is to take back with the c pawn, but then white gets hit with this beautiful d5. Again, because of that pin, the center is collapsing. Right, we're going to take on e4 next. And so in this game, knight takes d4 happened. Black played d5 anyways, knight b5, and now black has to find the only move that maintains the advantage. Surprisingly, this move is not the most obvious move. It is queen b8. We have to keep on the b8 h2 diagonal. The main problem is you don't want to go to d8 because of the rook on d1, and the secondary problem is you don't really want to go there because of bishop to e3. So queen b8 is the key move. White is facing some serious problems in the center. He has to take on d5. Notice he cannot take with the pawn due to this major pin going on the queen on e2 is misplaced. Rook takes d5, and after a6, knight d4, black trades on d4. Even though black slightly improves white structure, black does get two connected passers on the wing. Okay, and after b5, queen d3, bishop e6, this all happened in, again, correspondence game where black stands much better. He ended up winning the game. The rook is really awkward. Like I said, two bishops, we have a nice outpost. We can start running the pawns rather quickly, and white, even though he got his pawn back, he is clearly worse. So to summarize, against the Sicilian wing gambit, after the moves b4, I do recommend to take it. And here, play e5. Treat this as an e4, e5 opening, similar to the Evans gambit. Okay, you're always going to be pawn up, and at best case scenario, like I showed you, white may be able to get it back by giving up either the two bishops or key outpost. Thank you, and I hope you get to use these ideas in your own games.